On behalf of the Canada Plastics Pact team, let me first welcome you to today's webinar titled Roadmap to 2025, a shared action plan to build a circular economy for plastics packaging. My name is Isabelle Couture and I am a part of the support team for the CPP. We're absolutely delighted to welcome a large group today representing diverse positions across the value chain and of course joining us from across the country. So we have a great event planned for you today, all focused around the recent launch of the Canada Plastics Pact Roadmap. Over the next hour or so, we will provide you with a window into the development process of the roadmap, how we engaged 70+ partners to create a whole systems approach to addressing the plastics waste crisis. We're also going to be, of course, presenting on the final product, which we hope you've already had a chance to read through. And finally, we'll also want to hear from you. So there will be a lot of opportunities for you to comment and ask questions. And as part of that, you'll notice that there is in the bottom banner of your screen, there are two items. One is a chat box that you're welcome to use to introduce yourself, have some conversations with the other attendees, and there's also a Q&A feature where you can provide some questions for the speakers and for the team here. And with that, I would like to only take a brief moment to introduce you to the CPP Secretariat, the fantastic team behind the operations of the CPP. Many, if not all of us are on the call today, but you will also have the pleasure to hear from more of my colleagues, starting with CPP veteran Sarah Brooks, who will take you through our first engagement activity. And I believe with that, it's over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Isabelle and Mariam. We can get the Slido pull up on the screen. So good morning, good afternoon, good day, wherever in the world this finds you. I hope it finds you very well. My name is Sarah Brooks and I'm a core team member of the Canada Plastics Pact and have been with our host organization, Natural Step, for about 14 years now. And I'm speaking to you today from the unceded territories of the Sinixt Ktunaxa people. I'm also known as the Western Kootenay Mountains in British Columbia. So good to be here today with you all and thanks for coming. We will invite you to join us here at slido.com. We just want to get a sense of who's in the room and some of the issues that are important to you as we begin this discussion so that we can hopefully speak to some of those issues. So slido.com, #CPP Roadmap, and we can go ahead and actually just launch that first poll, Marian, as a way to get a feel for the issues that you're coming with today so that we can begin to speak to those. So the key drivers, so why are you here? What's interesting about the plastics packaging circular economy and the transition there too here in Canada for you? What are the main reasons that you are exploring this today? So join us at slido.com and go ahead and we'll begin to see what folks are feeling about that. So we'll just give that a moment or two. We've have about 200+ folks on the line, so we'll give it 30 seconds or so for people to feed in and just see. And you should be able to see on your screen some of the major reasons. So impact on the environment, of course, this is something we're seeing as a top issue in this community right now and really around the world. So impact on the environment from a plastic waste perspective is certainly one of the reasons why many of our partners have joined the Canada Plastics Pact, but also impact on the environment in terms of plastic production, associated greenhouse gas emissions, and the sort of life cycle analysis and carbon footprint of plastics, human health impacts that we're aware of, possibly some we're not yet, but ongoing understanding of the impact of this really important and material plastic that does a lot for us, both positive, but also it turns out negative to some extent too. So impact on the environment. We'll go just another 10 seconds here to let folks continue to feed in. There also is, of course, this idea of responding to customer or supplier demand. So we've seen that, whether that's in public pressure and resulting bans on some single-use items, both at home and abroad. And folks are looking for ways to participate in a circular economy. This is certainly something we're seeing amongst partners at the CPP, they're hearing that from their customers and their suppliers. So whether it's B2C or B2B, this is part of the conversation that is very much in the dialectic at this moment, very much part of the effort and the work. And then the question, of course, is if we are to have something that's circular, whether it's rigids, whether it's films and flexibles, whether it's reuse and refill options, how do we do that in a way that first, of course, doesn't create new problems by solving old ones, and that helps us to still have the margins that we need in order to be economically sound, that may even identify new business models and opportunities and so on. So this responding to customer and supplier demand and creating sustainable value, which we can see are sort of number 2 and 3 right now on the list here, are also drivers for members of the CPP and are helping to shape some of the work that we're doing within, which George will speak to in fairly short order. So we'll go ahead and close that poll, Marion. Thank you very much. And we are going to ask you to come right in, actually. So thank you very much for sharing some of the key drivers for you, the things that are precipitating interest in this conversation. And we'd also like to get a sense of you as individuals and how you're feeling about this. So the question that we'll ask is really around one word. So what is one key word that describes how you're feeling about the transition to a circular plastics packaging economy in Canada? How do you feel about it? And we'll ask you to just submit one word at a time. And you're welcome to submit more than one word, of course, but we'll ask you to just do one at a time because it makes it a little easier for the word cloud to form. Thank you for this. This is great. So how are you feeling about the transition? So folks know why they're here and why it's important, but how does it feel? Interesting. We seem to have certainly one that provides a centrifugal force. Thank you. Slow, yeah. Seems like that's coming up. And it's both challenging and optimistic, of course, because when there is a challenge, there's also an opportunity. However, some of these other words that are bolded are very good to explain part of that sort of narrative flow. Challenge equals opportunity. However, it's also confusing. It's difficult to know what the right steps to take are. Are they providing stepping stones for future actions? Are we heading in the right direction? What is that direction? Do we have a common language to talk about it? And how do we manage not only our feelings, but the economics, the technology, the social and cultural impacts or potential impacts? And how do we do that in a way that is both systemic and systematic, and that actually begins to create a better future than the one that we are not only in, but heading towards right now? Yeah, security of supply, thank you. Yep, no material available, some of these things. Okay, this is very helpful. Thank you for that. And we've got one final question for you before we go into the presentation. Again, we'll be able to speak to some of these as we go. So thank you for bearing with us as we try to get a sense of the issues and the folks that are in the virtual room together. So we recognize that there are drivers pushing us towards addressing the transition to a circular plastics packaging economy. So concern about the environment, responding to supplier and customer demand, creating sustainable value for our companies so that we have a role in the future. However, that journey is both confusing and slow. And so, but is it urgent? And it feels like it's starting to, that the answer is yes in this room. So it's either somewhat urgent or a burning platform. Okay, and we'll just keep that open for just a moment more, maybe 10 more seconds to let folks ring in on that, just to let you know who and what is in the room as we go into this discussion. Yeah, some folks not sure, absolutely fair. It's a big issue, it's difficult to know. And it looks like, generally speaking, for folks that are responding, there is some measure of urgency. For some, it's significant, and for some, it's perhaps a little less significant. However, the urgency remains, generally speaking, for the folks that are in this room. And thanks to folks that are inputting into the chat box there. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for your participation. So with the understanding then of some of these issues and the collective narrative that we're working with right now, I'm going to invite George Roeder, who will introduce himself. He's the Managing Director at the Canada Plastics Pact, to talk a little bit about one response to the way that many folks in this room are feeling. So why the Canada Plastics Pact was formed, who is part of it, how we're addressing it, and how we are also grappling as one group with some of both the challenges and the opportunities that have been identified by folks on the line. So thank you very much for that. And George, over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And to introduce myself again, George Roders, Managing Director of the Canada Plastics Pact. And it's great to have everyone on the line with us today and to have that really excellent participation in those polls. Thanks for working along with us to really make this interactive and to get your thoughts. And as I go along, I'll give a presentation for about 20 minutes or so. Feel free to jump in the chat box or the Q&A with any questions or discussions or comments that you have on anything that I'm going through today. So first of all, welcome to the Canada Plastics Pact. For those of you who aren't familiar with the CPP, we are a cross-value chain collaboration platform really looking at the challenge of plastic waste and transitioning to a circular economy for plastics packaging. We're now about just close to 80 partners that really range across the value chain, companies from resin production through to brands and retailers, converters, recyclers, waste management companies, and then leading organizations in the academic space, NGOs, stewardship organizations, and trade associations. So a real range of folks who have come together around this challenge. And we're very much energized by this broad new plastics economy vision that has been developed by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is very much around a holistic view on how we address this challenge of plastic waste and move to a circular economy for plastics packaging. And it really has three critical pillars. So first is making sure that really the only plastics packaging we are using are the ones that are absolutely necessary, and therefore eliminating some of the parts of that plastics packaging that is not. The second is making sure that we're innovating so that the plastics that we do need is recyclable, reusable, or compostable. And then finally, making sure that we are continuing to circulate plastics through the ecosystem, and so that it's in the economy and kept out of the environment. Really, our work is driven and energized by 4 ambitious targets for 2025. And I'll talk a bit about sort of the timescales in a moment. But I think from the Slido, I think there's a general sense in this room today and in general with the work of the CPP and the conversations we've had, is that there's a lot of urgency around this issue. And we need to address it and address it aggressively. And there's lots of challenges to doing that. But what these targets allow us to do is give us a bit of a marker on saying, all right, if we were to put specific numbers and specific outcomes against that urgency, here's what it would look like. And here's how it would energize this challenge and provide a holistic view. And so I won't read out what these targets are, but roughly they align with those 3 pillars. So ensuring that we are eliminating some of the plastics packaging that we don't need, making sure that what we have there is recyclable, reusable, or compostable, and that we're actually recycling it at scale. And then finally, making sure that there's demand for PCR content by having 30% PCR content across the packaging portfolios of the companies that have joined the CPP. So really, these targets are for the companies that have joined the CPP, but also energize and signify the broader aims of this work. Now, to talk a little bit about that and what those aims are, just to set up the problem space, which I probably don't need to do too much of with this crowd, but to just spend a moment on it. We know that plastics are extremely valuable in a variety of ways. They protect produce, various products, and are lightweight and have a lot of great properties. And so plastic packaging is something that we want as part of a sustainable packaging portfolio. Right now, we're putting a lot of it, 1.9 million tons of plastics packaging in 2019 on the market. And that is growing, and it has been growing quite a lot. And the challenge is that if we are ultimately aiming to be able to use this in a circular way, to move from this mental model and production model of taking stuff out of the ground, using it, and then discarding it, a linear make, take, waste economy, to a circular economy where we're continuing to move materials through the system again and again, we're quite far away from that circular economy. We did some work in the spring of this year to really look at plastics packaging flows across Canada, and really came to the conclusion that we're only at about 15% circularity if you look at the broad system in Canada, which with much of the material going either to landfill or waste to energy or into the environment. And we see that reflected globally as well. You know, an enormous amount of plastic showing up in our waterways and in our oceans. That obviously has extremely detrimental impacts. Using materials and either bringing them into waste to energy, which increases greenhouse gas emissions, or having them end up in landfills, which is not ultimately sustainable. We're quite far away from a circular economy for plastics packaging. So the challenge and the problem is front and center, and something that we need to address. And so what this roadmap really contemplates is a full breadth of actions and outcomes that are needed to really immediately make significant progress in a way that's systematic and that is holistic. And it really looks toward a vision of 2035 of where we want to end up, with a fair amount of detail and clarity on what a circular economy for plastics packaging could look like, and then works backwards and says, okay, what do we need to do between now and 2025 to be able to make significant progress to that longer term vision? And the purpose of this roadmap is certainly to put a bit of a plan together for those who have chosen to join the CPP, but we're also hoping that it can be an inspiration and a bit of a to-do list for everybody across the value chain, regardless of whether you're officially and formally part of the Canada Plastics Pact, that we very much see this as a roadmap to a full industry transition, not just a roadmap for CPP members. And so one of the things that was, I think, really crucial about building out this roadmap is that it was built using a collaborative process. And we brought in over 200 experts and organizations, started with work that had already been done either elsewhere in the world with other plastics pacts or a variety of different research that existed, brought in research that existed within the Canadian context, or action plans that existed, whether it's from the CCME, the Council of Ministers of the Environment, or the Smart Prosperity Institute, a great partner of CPP that put together a vision and critical barriers to be addressed in a circular plastics packaging economy. And we use that as really inputs to deep conversations across the value chain on what the current state was. And then immediately jump to starting to articulate what a vision for the future could look like. And then once that was established, started to backcast, really say, okay, if that's where we want to end up in 2035, what are the barriers that are stopping us from getting there, and what are the opportunities? And that led to a series of clarity on the outcomes and the actions that you'll see in here. And I wanted to just sort of at this moment pause myself for a second and invite Jen Barbatza, as the co-chair of our advisory council, to just maybe make some comments on the process of that roadmap coming together. So Jen, over to you.
Thanks so much, George, and thanks for the introduction. So for those of you who don't know me, as George mentioned, I'm the co-chair of the CPP Advisory Council. I also work for Walmart Canada on all things sustainable, or trying to become more sustainable, as it were. So really wanted to touch on a couple of things that made the roadmap development and CPP, quite frankly, in general, a little bit different from some of the other kind of working groups and initiatives that I had been involved in the past. And I'm sure many of you on the phone have been as well, or on the line today. What really makes this sort of roadmap creation and project and CPP unique is that we're bringing diverse stakeholders from all across the value chain. So when we're doing that and we're putting everybody in the same room who aren't typically in the same room, we started to notice a lot of synergies and a lot of looking at problems in a slightly different light. So for example, when we were creating the roadmap, if we had a question on something, or if I had a question on a resin type, we had resin manufacturers in the room at the table to be able to answer the question and or turn it around a little bit to say, this is what it looked like from my seat. This is how they look at it from their seat. So it's really opening everyone's eyes as to what the full robust set of challenges is, but coming together collaboratively to also problem solve. So, as George mentioned, it wasn't just a, what can I do or what problems am I having? It's how can we, the collective we, work together to start to solve those problems. And I think that was really, really exciting and really invigorating just to have that many minds that you really don't see at the table together, all working on the same end product and contributing to make something really exciting in the roadmap itself. I think the other thing that's really exciting, and I know we touched on it at the beginning with the Slido poll, a lot of us have been feeling like we're moving slowly, like what's the next thing to do? With the development of the roadmap, we've tried to break it down into key tangible go-dos. It's also a way for us to hold ourselves as a group accountable for making action against those tangible items. So if something's working, let's give ourselves credit for it. If there's something that we're veering off the path, let's look at that and reevaluate how do we bring it back to the path. Or do we need to shift the focus just slightly? So, having this roadmap planned out to the most part means we don't have to keep circling back and saying, oh, wait, what were we doing over here? It's one vision, a linear vision that we're working toward, that it allows us for constant movement forward with maybe some small tweaks and course corrections as we move along. But I mean, I think if you can't tell by the excitement that I typically portray when I'm talking about the CPP, I'm really looking forward to, and I'm pleased to see all of the movement forward we've made as a group already. I know that I too have been one person saying, we've got to move faster. And I think we're seeing that momentum is there, the passion and the engagement around the entire CPP team and everyone working to contribute to it are all feeling that same invigoration and that rush. It really does feel like, now is the time, and that we're seeing everyone come together to work to that common goal, which is just amazing to see everyone working this way. That's sort of all I had, George.
Thanks for that, Jen. Really appreciate you jumping on, and absolutely also appreciate your leadership in the CPP over the last months as we built this together. So many of you have probably seen the actual roadmap or roadmap website and document, and I want to dive into that a little bit right now. But if you haven't, feel free after this to go to roadmap.plasticspact.ca to download it and check out what's there. What I wanted to make sure to do is actually just give some highlights and then really provide some space for a couple other people who've been instrumental in building the roadmap to share some thoughts as we go along, and then to be able to have an open Q&A as we go through this. So first of all, I talked about us starting really at the vision level, and we stepped back and we asked, we've been talking about a circular economy for plastics packaging, and we know what those pillars are at a global level, but what does this mean at a detailed level, and could we map this out a bit to build a bit of a strategy? And so we started here and did a variety of work, really starting to articulate, okay, what are the components of this? And I'll admit that a lot of the conversation really focused on the right side of this diagram, the supply and the demand for circular plastics packaging. So to have that circular economy, we need to have plastics going into circulation, we need to have the demand. And both of those are going to need to be required in order to especially have a very robust, economical and effective and optimized recycling system. What we also know is that there's a bunch of plastics packaging that is really tricky to actually recycle. And there's a bunch that we're putting on the market right now that is not necessary. It's not serving a very strong function. And there's opportunities to really reuse and recirculate, not in the recycling system, but in a business model sense, plastics packaging much more. And so that third piece, the plastics packaging and the amount of plastic used, reduced at source, is a critical part of a circular economy for plastics packaging. And in fact, it's where a lot of work can happen upstream, and effort can have really, really strong rewards later on in the process, because you're actually preventing material from moving into the system that isn't necessary. And so those key characteristics really come next. And we started to look at the interactions between these different parts of the strategy. And so if you look at something like this plastics packaging reduced at source, it's, as I said, moving away from some packaging and some packaging formats in the supply chain, and then also seeing reuse displacing significant single use as efficient reverse supply chains come on board. And then under this supply and demand side, what you're seeing is this dynamic between a really strong and optimized system to collect, sort, and process material, balanced against this integrated supply chain where companies are really seeing, the material that they're putting in, the end of life actually becomes a crucial part of their supply chain, and the supply of the recycled plastics that will eventually sort of come back into the plastics packaging that they're putting on the market. And then a crucial piece here really around packaging design, to make sure that that design really optimizes for that supply that's on the market. What we also understand is, even if all of those pieces, from a business and a supply model work really well, there's a series of enablers that will allow all of that to happen. And we've put down and really identified 4 key enablers. So one is around data and measurement, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a moment. A second around consistent policies and well-designed policies that are able to drive some of the shifts and transitions that are necessary. A third is we know that leaders in various sectors, business, nonprofits, governments, and media, and customers within the supply chain, and that's not necessarily consumers, but it can be customers all over the supply chain, need to be aligned. And part of the role of having this roadmap is to gain that alignment in the plastics value chain. And then finally, to really have this exchange of information between participants. I think one of the most interesting things that came out of the building of the roadmap is that we heard a lot that folks were, as Jen said, having conversations that haven't happened before and exchanging information that hasn't necessarily happened or been enabled otherwise. So let me dive in really from that broad vision and that broad strategy to what are the priorities for the next 3.5 years. We really articulated 3 of these under which there's a variety of different outcomes and activities. And I'm just going to highlight a few of these very briefly as we go along to make sure that we have ample time for questions. So the first is around reducing, reusing, and collecting. So recognizing that right now you have 70% of the material that will never makes it into a recycling system, and some of that will never ever have the chance to make it into a recycling system, regardless of how much we optimize the collection. And so we really do need to reduce some of that material, and we can do that either through direct elimination of some formats or through the scaling of reuse models. And I think that a good example of this is around the challenge of flexible packaging. We did a deep dive, as I said, on some of the data that is behind plastics packaging flows. And what we really saw is that there's a challenge that everybody on the call here, I'm sure, knows around flexible packaging. A very small fraction is actually getting collected, and then that which is getting collected, a pretty small fraction is getting recycled in Canada. And it's a problem that's actually growing in the sense that more companies are moving to flexible packaging, plastics packaging, for obvious reasons. It's lightweight, it's really accepted by consumers and end users. There's a whole bunch of really good reasons, but it is a challenging material to manage and to see a path towards circularity. And so addressing this challenge really comes out of the roadmap in two really critical outcomes. One is saying, listen, there's probably a bunch of flexible plastic packaging that's put on the market right now that is that's unnecessary, and that we need to identify what some of those things are. So maybe that's that seal that's around the top of a jam jar. Maybe that's a plastic covering over top of a magazine wrapper, or of a magazine, or a greeting card, or possibly, and this is where it becomes more complicated, of course, around produce wraps. So it's really understanding and looking at, okay, where are some of these unnecessary pieces, and how do we build really robust criteria so that we can give guidance, especially on the flexible packaging that's put on the market, what should and what shouldn't be there, knowing that it's very challenging to ultimately collect. The other side is actually saying, like, hey, let's look more clearly at this challenge, and in particular, the challenge of collection, recycling, developing robust end markets. And let's figure out, okay, what are the pieces within this that we can make progress on and make sure that we have a collective across value chain view and a very strong action plan around addressing this challenge of flexible packaging. So it's a good example of where the roadmap has a variety of different pieces around a particular challenge that the industry is facing. The second priority is around optimizing the recycling system. And there's, I think, a variety of pieces here that really looks at both the supply side and the demand side. So on the supply side, of course, there's a particular challenge around infrastructure development. And a soon-to-be released study from ECCC estimates the required infrastructure investment in sorting, dismantling, processing, and ultimately recycling plastics at somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 to $6.5 billion between now and 2030 if we want to reach the ambitious goals that the federal government has laid forth on plastics and plastics packaging recycling rates. And so this is a real, these are real numbers. The question is, where is this money being spent, and how can we correctly inform how this infrastructure money is going to get deployed and from where it's getting deployed? And some of that's a policy question. Some of that is businesses that are increasingly having control under EPR, knowing what are the right technologies to invest in, and how do we understand the pathways that are going to get us to a circular plastics packaging economy and that optimized recycling system. The other side is really getting even the upstream of that, really getting alignment there on what is good design, what is great design for recyclability. And in this case, the CPP in Canada has partnered up with the Consumer Goods Forum globally that has identified a set of golden design rules, realizing that there's good guidelines on recyclability, and yet many of those guidelines really aren't being built in a ambitious way to plastics packaging design today. Can we develop a set of rules, or really a short list that companies can use that will have the biggest impact on improving the inputs to the recycling system? And so we really have been working closely with within the Canada Plastics Pact to get alignment on companies across the value chain and articulating and really understanding what these golden design rules look like in a Canadian context. And what's amazing about these is there's these 9 rules that have alignment at the global level. We're able to provide clarity on what those look like in Canada, and then be able to provide educational supports with partners like Pact Global and others to be able to actually roll these out in a broad way within Canada, which would dramatically improve the inputs to the recycling system. So that would be an example of the types of actions that you'll see and that we've really started to unpack within the Canada Plastics Pact roadmap. And with that, I actually wanted to bring someone else on, Aidin Quinn, who is at EFS Plastics, to talk a little bit about what her experience has been with those golden design rules and overall the Plastics Pact. Aidin, over to you.
Yeah, hi, thank you, George. Hi, everyone. So my name is Aidin Quinn with EFS Plastics. We're a post-consumer plastic recycler. We focus on some of the lower value streams coming out of recycling facilities. So the 3 through 7 mixed plastics and the film plastics. And yeah, the process of contributing to the Canadian Golden Design Rules has been very interesting because they're not kind of vague rules that you should keep in the back of your mind when you're designing. Sometimes you come across things that say reduce color or try to keep it very vague. What I like about the Canada Design Guidelines is that they really drill into the nitty-gritty, and there was a lot of back and forth on kind of very specific items of it, and I think the final product is very useful for the Canadian context. And it's important to have it for Canada because what they're doing in Europe, what they're doing in the US can be really different. Canada has a very extensive long-term recycling infrastructure that has built up over the last few decades, something that, in some areas of the US does not exist. So, like, for example, someone mentioned in the questions, I just saw one come in about, number 4 plastic. In the American context, there is very sparse infrastructure for collecting that material. You have to bring it back to a retail store. Not everyone has access to it. It's true that also in Canada, there's a lot of work to be done to expand access, but most major cities across Canada have access to recycling that material. And that's something that is reflected in the design guidelines. Polyethylene film does have end markets in Canada. And yeah, I mean, I think it all comes back to building the supply. If we want to have a stronger supply of recycled content available for Canadian companies, we have to make sure that the material going into the system is recyclable. And sometimes there's very small changes that can be made that can turn a package from a contaminant to the recycling stream to a positive addition to the recycling stream. And just one small thing that I find really useful in the design guidelines is that focus on using recycled content in business-to-business packaging. There's a lot of focus right now on getting recycled content in consumers' hands, which is of course really important, but there's so many opportunities in those work in progress items or items that are happening packaging behind the scenes, that there's real opportunities, and I appreciate that the design guidelines highlight those opportunities there. So yeah, thank you very much.
Aidin, thanks so much for joining us and sharing those thoughts, and also your contributions. I think in being able to bring sort of that perspective from a recycler that's actually kind of dealing with this material on, okay, here's almost my wish list for what I'd love to see on the design side, I think has been extremely insightful, and I think provided a lot of insight to a lot of the brand owners and producers of these plastics through the process. So yeah, anyway, thank you so much. Just moving on to our last priority here, which is using data to improve the whole system. I'll just spend a moment on this and highlight 2 things. One is right now what we realized is in building the roadmap, we started to trip over just something like people use the same word to mean different things within this world. And there's a lot of variability on definitions. And the CSA group just released a really great report, which I would encourage you all to take a look at, really looking at, okay, what would a definition around recycling look like, and what would a standard around that look like, and how would that help to drive performance in the overall system? And that's everything from what do we mean when we say recycling to where in the system do we actually measure that in order to be able to set targets that are consistent across the country, and that we can use by both sort of companies and policy makers to be able to understand what's going to drive performance. What we also saw, and something that we're digging into with another partner of the CPP, the BC government, is the challenge around understanding where plastics go when it goes to the institutional, commercial, or industrial sector. So if it goes to a hospital or a university, or industrial facility or an office tower, that packaging is managed in a completely different way than to residences. And there's very little visibility on that. And it's a good example of where up until this point, people have sort of said, what we heard during the roadmap development process is that people have said, listen, this is hard. There's not a lot of visibility into this. Let's just leave that and focus on the residential side. But that may leave out up to half the amount of packaging that's plastics packaging that's generated in Canada, which is a big part of the challenge. And so for the first time, we're really diving deep on IC&I and really starting to uncover and understand what do the flows look like that in that area, and how do we understand the challenges there. And we're starting in BC, and we'll be doing that elsewhere in the country. So what could this all mean for you? And I'll this is my last slide, and then I'm going to hand it to one other CPP partner before taking questions. But the first is, really saying, use this roadmap as an inspiration. Grab the various different outcomes or the key opening moves and say, how do you align your company's or your organization's plans and priorities to this? And also reach out and say, listen, like this is an area that we collaboratively would like to work on together. Let's do so. A second, which is really sharing and connecting with your network around this roadmap. So starting conversations with your suppliers or with your customers to say, what are you seeing here? How are you driving action in addressing plastic waste? And how is your work and how are your organizational priorities connecting to the roadmap? And then finally, feel free to reach out to us. Please do at the Pact and explore joining formally the Canada Plastics Pact. It's not for everyone and it's not necessary, but we'd love to have you if that's something that you're interested in. You can email info@plasticspact.ca, and that'll be in the chat box in a moment as well. And with that, I just want to actually hand it over, maybe just one more partner of ours, Len Giglio from Tempo Plastics, to just talk a little bit about what he's experienced in terms of diving in and working on this within the context of the CPP.
Hi,
Len,
George.
over to you.
Hi, George, and thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. I think it's been a very valuable partnership as well. As a manufacturer, we've already made significant investments, and the CPP is giving us some insight, and there's alignment, and it's forming some structure that will allow us to continue to invest and further develop and spend our R&D efforts in the right direction. And by hearing the challenges of brand owners, retailers, or people like Aidin and her company, and other various stakeholders, it shines a light on our blind spots. And we definitely see a lot of value in this collaboration. The roadmap is definitely not perfect by any means, but what I like is this forum is not just an echo chamber. I mean, we definitely debate and we engage each other, and we're trying to separate the wheat from the chaff, and we're not trying to burn the whole thing to the ground. It's about figuring out what's good and then building on that and moving towards that common goal. And I think that's what the CPP has brought to Tempo in particular, and the Golden Design Rules has given us some direction that now we have a target and we're going to start heading that direction, and it's been great so far.
Great, thanks for that, Len, and great to have Tempo. I think around the table when you joined, you sort of said, we're joining with a bunch of much larger organizations, and this is a big thing for us. And having your leadership as, I would say more medium-sized, but growing quickly organization has been great as well. So we are at the point now where we wanted to move in and actually do one more poll for everyone here. So Marion, if you want to throw up that poll question, the last one. And then what we're going to do is dive into questions that we're seeing from the audience. So I'm just going to curate those as folks are throwing their thoughts in this poll. So the question there in the poll that's being asked now, if you go to slido.com and CPP Roadmap, which aspects of the roadmap are most compelling to act on for your company or organization? And we'll just see how that comes in, and at the same time now start to curate a few questions. So a few questions from the Q&A. I'll take one first. How is Canada intending to address the collection of plastics for commercial customers? Collection is a huge issue for me because I'm struggling to collect even valuable recyclables that we can receive rebates for, such as metal and plastics, from my stores because of the lack of partners willing to collect these materials from my stores. So first of all, great question. Thank you for this. One of the really interesting things that we've heard through this ICAI study in British Columbia that we're diving into with a great partner in policy integrity is exactly this. There's a bunch of especially Main Street businesses that don't have a great collection options that are out there. And so our approach to this right now and what we're hearing is first shine a light on the issue to really be able to say, listen, this is the nature of the issue. This is how it's happening, and this is how it's happening at scale. And we just had a conversation yesterday with someone who highlighted pharmacies and the plastic containers that they have in pharmacies that roughly just don't always get collected, or there aren't necessarily obvious recycling pathways for those. But those are, bottles made of HDPE, obviously recyclable and obviously valuable. This is a good example, and really the approach there is to shine a light on the issue in a way that allows us to start to look at policy options and then options where businesses can dig in. Great, so that was the first question. It's great to see the poll that's up here right now, seeing folks are really focused on priority 1 and 2, which makes a whole lot of sense. Although really good to see some folks on the call who are really thinking about what this data side looks like. Let me pick up another question here around what measures are in place to ensure that these priority outcomes are achieved. So there's lots of great actions, but how do you ensure they get implemented? So great question. So first of all, as part of the CPP, one of the things that we have in place is an annual reporting process. So what we'll be doing is we'll be every year understanding what the various folks who have signed up to the CPP are doing, what their progress looks like, and then being able to publish a report, which we're hoping to have the first year report published towards the end of March or early April, to really say, okay, here's the state of things right now, and here's what's going well, and here's what's not going as well. And also here's some inspirations for how folks are developing innovative solutions or ideas that are really driving this forward. And so we're not really designing it as a way to publicly sort of call out which companies or organizations are moving forward faster or less fast. But we're using it as a way to sum up and say, together as a system, we've committed to these things. How are we doing on this? And so we'll be doing that on a yearly basis, at least, and probably, well, absolutely more regularly, be monitoring interim results on an ongoing basis within the confines of the Canada Plastics Pact. Great. So let me dive in on a couple more questions. This is great that questions are coming in. Thanks so much, everybody. What's the engagement with the government on policy is one of the questions. So we have numerous levels of governments who are part of the Canada Plastics Pact. Municipal governments like Metro Vancouver, the City of Edmonton, City of Toronto, City of Montreal are all members. Provincial governments, the province of BC, as I mentioned, and as well the federal government through Environment and Climate Change Canada. So they're all participating in the pact. And one of the things that I think they're seeing, both through this roadmap and through this participation, is they're getting access to the cross value chain conversations that Jen really talked about, of having different experts with different perspectives interacting with one another in a way that starts to inform where businesses and where NGOs are able to move the ball on their own, but where government policy needs to be designed either to encourage that, bolster it, or drive action and gaps that are not otherwise being filled. Let me dive into a few more questions here in the Q&A. And I'll pick one up actually because there are some in Slido. Yeah, so there's a question here around whether or not there's Canadian organizations that provide certification for packaging as recyclable or compostable. So certainly on the compostable side, there's certifications that you'll see out there. So BPI is one as a good example. On the recyclable side, this is a bit more of a complicated question. Certainly there are indications in many ways about what is recyclable in this and when you can claim something as recyclable. And so there's definitely a policy framework there that is in place that even allows a company to claim something as recyclable. But beyond that, in terms of actually certifying packages as truly getting recycled at scale, that doesn't exist right now in a very in a formalized way. And so one of the things that we're trying to do in the context of this roadmap and through publishing the Golden Design Rules is to start to at least standardize a set of, as Aidin sort of pointed out, very specific standards that we can use and that companies can use during their design processes to dive in to really understand what is and what isn't recyclable and how do we make some of those design decisions. And so that's really a really key piece. Whether that ultimately results in a certification that is out there, that's published, it remains to be seen, and we're not directly working on that. But that's definitely in the same vein of getting agreement and then being able to have something that you can actually measure against that allows you to understand whether or not something is truly recyclable. So I'm just focused on time a little bit, and I want to make sure that we wrap up with plenty of time to the top of the hour. And so what we'll aim to do is to say, if you do have any additional questions that weren't answered through this webinar, we'll try to reach out to you and get those answered. And if you want to reach out to us, you can also do so at info@plasticspact.ca. So if you go to info@plasticspact.ca, we'd be happy to get back to you over the next little while.